take Greece as a draft.
Yeah, but afterwards we're all done, they'll hit return and we'll all be good.
Yeah, they'll return at the end when they're all 100 pages.
Click the button.
Can you just ask like
Are you the teacher?
Yeah.
Gracie?
I think so.
I hope Block Blast gets banned.
Hey, why would you ever say that?
I hate this app.
As you're playing.
Yeah, but it's stupid.
Yeah, what's it has for?
Jules, you should really listen. Higher than yours.
Hey, what do I click?
Where is it?
Is it video? Yeah.
No, it's a video.
Yeah. So the big
Mine's 9,000.
right? Yeah. And then it should go,
So,
Interesting. Schizophrenia is so interesting.
I know.
mental disorders, we all know about them. It causes a bunch of defects in the people that we know, and it's affected humanity throughout history. And schizophrenia has to be the worst example of how biology could go wrong. So I'm going to begin with what it's not. So it's not an adjective to describe your schizzy moments or your schizo days. It's not like depression where, oh, I was so depressed this one time. It is a genuine disease and it should not be used that way. 2, it's not just hallucinations or delusions. There's more to it than just that. Hallucination and delusions are a part of the positive symptoms that schizophrenics exhibit, and there are also negative symptoms that are involved with cognitive dissonance. 3, it takes years or months to fully diagnose someone. You can't just see someone do some stupid thing and call them a schizophrenic for that. And 4, it's a multivariant disease with many subtypes. It's kind of reminiscent of autism, where there's a spectrum of it, there's different kinds of it, and that same formula applies to schizophrenia. There's a spectrum of it. And 5, like with autism, there's also savant, where there's hidden blessings to it. But schizophrenia, there isn't any hidden blessings. It's a horrifying disease, and I would not recommend trying to get it. So, what is it fundamentally? It is a disease where if you talk to someone, you notice that there's something a little off about them. There's something different about their thinking. So what does this mean? So I've divided abnormal thinking into 3 categories. To begin with, we'll start with loose associations. What does that mean? Tangential thinking. They can't stick to the topic when you talk to them. So for example, let's say you're talking about a boxer, fighting and all of that. A schizophrenic may have difficulties discerning between a boxer, a dog, or a boxer, an occupation. They can't really figure out what exactly you're talking about. Number 2, consequentially, because of loose associations, they have severe difficulties in abstraction as well. So give them a metaphor or a proverbs test. I found this one proverb back in the World War II era that describes how you need to be careful about the messages that you send to your relatives, because the enemies, they might be able to snatch that message up and actually use it so that they could, construct their plan and all that. The term was known as loose lips sink ships. What does that mean? It means you need to be careful about what you write, or else the enemy might actually take it. But if you tell this to a schizophrenic, they're just going to imagine big lips devouring ships and all that. So it's really difficult for them to actually understand what kind of metaphorical phrase you're trying to tell them. And 3, delusions of grandeur. They take unusual amount of credit for things that obviously isn't the case. For example, they could say, hey, the Great Wall of China? That was me. I built it. And that isn't the case, obviously. So where are these deficits most apparent? It's a disease of frontal abnormalities. We all know what the frontal lobe is. It is a disease of an atrophied frontal lobe. It appears that they resort to the least cognitively demanding form of communication. And it's not purposeful because that's all they can do. It's all they know. This is also known as concreteness of thought, and at the worst case scenario, they rely on alliterations and rhymes with no actual meaning behind them. If you don't know what alliterations are, it's a sequence of words where each word begins with the same letter. And schizophrenics, they like saying that repeatedly without actual meaning behind them. So what can we conclude with this? They can't cognitively assess the falseness behind their delusions. They don't have the cognitive capability to stick to the topic. They don't have the cognitive capability to abstractly analyze the subject. And they can't be rational due to a weakened frontal lobe. But all of us, we have our own irrational moments. So are we all schizophrenic? Obviously not. So to begin, let's figure out what the frontal lobe is. What is it designed to do? It aids in orienting your actions to a specific formula. So imagine your mother gave you a list to go to the grocery store and buy these specific products, and then you can easily follow this list because you're frontally capable of doing that. But schizophrenics might have a little bit of difficulty with that. It aids in abstraction. The frontal lobe aids in abstraction. You're able to recognize metaphors and what they mean. Let's imagine the metaphor: a rolling moss gathers a rolling stone gathers no moss. Sorry. What does that mean? If you're on the move, nothing bad is gonna happen to you. But schizophrenics, they might take that literally and literally imagine a rolling stone and say, well, stone's moving. It's not able to gather any moss. They're gonna take a literal approach to it. The frontal lobe aids in doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do. To some of you that are runners and like running, it's painful, it sucks, but you have to keep doing it. With an atrophied frontal lobe, you're not going to be able to do that as effectively. So runners, they have pretty decent frontal lobes. And finally, it aids in doing the more socially appropriate thing when it's the harder thing to do. And we see this in schizophrenics. They're not really that socially appropriate whatsoever. So, what is the difference between schizophrenic irrationality and controlled irrationality? Well, what we see here is a progressive degeneration of the ventricles inside your brain. Pretty sure it's cerebral spinal fluid, I don't know. But this is a 34-year-old female with chronic schizophrenia, and this is a 10-year timeline of a cross-section of her brain. Starting in February 1990, she began exhibiting her first episode, and over time, these ventricles you see in the middle right here, they start to slowly grow. And what we see here, this is a really extreme case. What we see here, as these ventricles increase, it starts actually shrinking and slicing up all the other parts of the brain. It shrinks the other parts of the brain. Therefore, it causes an atrophied frontal lobe. So now we have one explanation as to why schizophrenics have atrophied frontal lobes. So why does this occur? One reason could be the genetic factors involved in this degenerative process. So let's look at the statistics. Take a pair of identical twins with one of them having schizophrenia. The other twin has about a 50% chance of developing the disease. Isn't that weird? Because it seems to be a genetic component to it. And identical twins meaning, pretty sure monozygotic twins where they share the same portion of the uterus. I think that's what it is. I'm not sure. But fraternal twins 17, your offspring 13, your sibling 9, parent 6, aunts, uncles 2, random person off the street 1 or 2%. So what can we conclude from this, considering that there's genetic components to it? What we see here is that there's huge genetic predisposition factors involved in the disease. It's not irrationality. So what exactly is in this genetic coding? Well, here it is, FOXP2, C4, GR. I'm not going to talk about all of that. There are so many genetic factors that we don't know the actual true reason or cause of schizophrenia. We can't find a consistent answer because of the individual differences that elicits an uprising of the disease. So why don't we take a look at mouse studies? So So humans, we're capable of, as we age, we go through certain maturation bursts. So imagine a timeline of 80 years. From when you're born, about a handful of times, your brain experiences a cortical maturation burst. And let's say like 5 years old, it suddenly expands in size, and then 5 years down the line, same thing, up until your age 25. And that's why people say that your brain is fully matured at the time you're 25, because that's when the final cortical maturation burst happens. And then after that, your brain slowly starts degenerating. But during the process, when you're around 18 to 25, the brain, it likes to do this pruning process where it just literally destroys unused neurons, and unused and useless neurons in that case. And this is mediated by the C4 gene. And what we see here, take a controlled patient with nothing wrong with them, no schizophrenia, rip out their C4 gene and put it in a rat, the rat's perfectly fine. But take the C4 gene and put it in a rat from a schizophrenic, and what we see here is the rat starts exhibiting more schizophrenic-like symptoms. So that's, yeah. So another example of a mouse study. So the study was done in a family who had a rare language disorder called developmental verbal dyspraxia. It's not that they don't know what to say, it's not that they suffer paralysis of their vocal cords, it's that translation process from thought to vocal cords, or speech. The translation process is defective in this family. So they ripped out the FOXP2 gene in this family and put it in rats, and the rats actually started exhibiting less effective communication. So if you actually take this FOXP2 gene from a normal controlled patient, because humans, we actually have a really robust FOXP2 gene compared to other mammalians and all that. I mean, we're able to communicate. It makes sense. So take it out of a human, stick it in a rat, and what you see here is the rat turns into Mickey Mouse. So what actually happens is that the rat starts communicating in a much more effective manner compared to its peers. So, yeah. So mediating symptoms, I didn't have enough time to do this, but there was a drug called L-Dopa. So dopa, that sounds familiar, dopamine, dopa. You give it to a schizophrenic, and then their symptoms actually start alleviating. But the issue here is that, so let's think of it as a baseline level of dopamine. The dopamine levels of the brain in the schizophrenic are lower, and then everywhere else in the brain it's baseline. Give them this drug, increase their dopamine levels. Their schizophrenic part, dopamine levels, they come baseline, they come back to normal, but everywhere else actually gets worse. So because of that, they start exhibiting more Parkinson-like symptoms, because in Parkinson, the motor cortex of the brain has defective dopamine receptor and all that.
So it's too much dopamine.
I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Yeah.
Or it could be the other way around, I'm not sure.
Or the receptors are dying and not allowing.
Yeah, that's the case. So
part of the dopamine to be
reverse
taken
what I
out.
was talking about. So let's look at the chronological upbringing of the disease. Just like any other disease, it starts with your ancestors, your genetics, all that down the line. We can't really figure out what's going on there because it was millions of years in the past. I don't think anyone has a time machine to do that. So let's look at the genetics then. Genetic components, I talked about the familial history, all this, 50% chance, all that. There's genetic components to it. There's specific deficits to it. There's also prenatal environment. So let's look at a Dutch hunger winter. So during World War II, the Nazis, they took all the supplies of a certain tribe or town or whatever in Europe, and the the mothers that were pregnant, specifically with the babies in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, when the mother starts experiencing deficits in nutrition, the baby is actually more likely to develop schizophrenia-like symptoms as they age. And then there's also childhood trauma. If you kick your frontal lobe once too many times, you are more than likely to develop the disease, but only to people who are genetically predisposed to actually exhibit more of a chance to get schizophrenia if their frontal lobe was kicked. And then there's adulthood trauma, and then there's other environmental factors involved, such as drugs, methamphetamine. We all know what that is, Breaking Bad, all that. Methamphetamine is involved with dopamine. So why is it that when you overdose with dopamine, you start exhibiting, or methamphetamine, you start overdosing with methamphetamine, you start exhibiting more schizophrenic-like symptoms? And that's because if you break it down to its component pieces, methamphetamine, we see more dopamine involved. There's dopamine involved with disease, as we see here. It's pretty weird. And then, so how can we prevent the upbringing of this disease? You guys remember when I said there's a 1 to 2% chance you snatch someone off the street, 1 to 2% chance you might share schizophrenic genetics with them. To de-schizize yourself, or whatever that means, try to get an effective diet, mostly involving omega-3s, antioxidants, and remove seed oils and artificial sugars from your diet. What's the benefit with omega-3s? It gives your brain fat to insulate your axons and make the messages move faster. Antioxidants, it's antitoxins, antioxidants. Seed oils and artificial sugars, they degenerate your brain. You do not want that.
Right, so no Diet Coke, no canola oil or corn oil, only cook with olive oil. Omega-3s are like salmon, right?
Yeah, you can also take a supplement version of it too.
Yeah, antioxidants like vitamin C, really important. And what is the average onset of schizophrenia?
And
Age?
yeah, the average onset is, so you guys remember when I said the cortical maturation burst at around the age of 16, 25, where it's at the end of, when your cortical maturation burst is at the end of its timeline. At around that time, early adulthood and up until the age of 25, you start, in schizophrenics, that's when they develop and elicit schizophrenic symptoms.
So it's like 23, so you could be completely normal.
Well,